Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power right here on ITV Networks channel 347. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 55 minutes to 1 hour. Well, tomorrow President Cyril Ramaphosa will deliver his fourth State of the Nation address since becoming president in 2018. Well, a lot of us remember his first State of the Nation in that very year. It was filled with promise, but still some of the challenges remain in South Africa. What are we going to do with regards to the SOEs? Unemployment continues to rise. Ratings agencies have downgraded South Africa. And then, of course, there is a certain COVID-19, which has now come to South Africa and haunted the nations. Well, death rates continues to rise. Infections rates continues to rise. And we're asking ourselves, what is the way forward? Well, of course, the vaccine rollout and the treatment that would put South Africa back on its economic recovery. Well, to discuss the State of the Nation, which is set to be happening tomorrow, I have with me political analyst Ungama Mtimka, and just after the half an hour mark, I will have with us Kaya Sitole. Well, let me bring in Ungama. Ungama, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on ITV Networks.
Good evening, Faraz. Thank you for having me this evening.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Ungama, the first big question we have to ask. It's 4 years now, of course, the fourth year of President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation. A lot of promise there was in 2018. Of course, there are certain mitigating factors like COVID-19, which has pushed South Africa back. But of course, after last year's State of the Nation address, we had, of course, South Africa going into a recession. What are your hopes going into tomorrow's State of the Nation?
I'm hoping that we can move away in South Africa from the practice of measuring government performance by looking at input alone. So, for example, if government has said we have created so much money in order to help businesses, I wish that our focus would change from being about that to be outcomes based. So what has been done, what has been achieved. What you will find is that in successive State of the Nation addresses, the presidents tend to focus on broad indicators which they choose depending on which indicators tell a good story for them, and then will make a slew of promises which they commit to. But in the following year, they don't come by starting from whatever indicators which arose from the promises they made in the previous statement and show how government performed against those. But they will find something which worked in that year, which they want to write home about, and then not emphasize anything else that did not work. So it's time that we develop a framework for these statements, one that looks at key aspects of state performance and say, President, you have to report on these, and these are the bases upon which we will look at the general state of the nation.
Ungama, now that you mention it, and of course the performance of the government, there was something that was gazetted last year. Maybe you'll be able to just shed some light on it, on performance basis for ministers. When will that be able to kick in? Because as taxpayers, you know, we want to see the ministers performing and performing well to be able to have that output on the communities and the citizens at large. But if there aren't ministers that aren't performing, surely they should be taken to task for this.
We have a problem there for us. It was not the first time that the idea of signed performance agreements with ministers was touted. You'd recall that within the first year of President Zuma coming into office back in 2009, there were commitments, and those commitments got to be translated into assigned performance scorecards for ministers. You'd recall that it came with about 9 outcomes. So we had outcomes 1 to 9, depending on which applied to particular departments. But we don't have a political culture that's geared towards performance evaluation in the country. And part of the reason why that is so is because the governing party hasn't built an independent framework of monitoring performance, because what matters to politics of the ANC has been a lot more alliances and loyalty to those alliances, more than what a person, whether they are a minister or an MEC or a councillor, do while they are deployed. So what makes these performance frameworks fail is the fact that politically, in order to determine whether you stay in office or you get booted out, that doesn't matter at all. What matters politically is whether, while you are in office, you did things which strengthened the position of your faction. So that's why we have a big problem, is that the political culture itself is not performance sensitive, but built for alliances. So you're not going to blame an ANC politician who, while in the office, decides that creating a patronage network that sustains them and their faction in office is more important than delivering on what the mandate of the department they lead is about.
Ngama, just before obviously we went on air, the research that I did, of course, with last year's State of the Nation address, and we have to touch on the SOEs and especially Eskom. And as we speak, we're in another stage of load shedding here in South Africa. Now, Eskom has said that load shedding is going to be for us for a while. This is, and crisis is a mild word to describe what's going on in Eskom. This is becoming much more than a disaster. What is the way forward for government? Obviously, the three splits of the generations within Eskom has been in discussion, but what does government have to do now to solve this problem? But because without power, we can't have a functioning economy.
Sure. So if you look at the challenges in the state-owned enterprises, you will find that, one, they are highly indebted. Two, the business models are not delivering value in a sustainable way. Three, there are turnaround plans which have been done, but there isn't capable leadership to lead those institutions through the murky waters of uncertainty through change, so that they get to where they need to be in order for them to deliver. And we have this tendency in South Africa of hiring executives that sometimes may have the potential, but are limited by the political environment from taking action that is necessary in order to turn those state entities around. Or sometimes the political leadership is too overbearing on those executives, and they don't give them space to lead in such ways that they turn around the entities to operate efficiently. When it comes to Eskom, what further complicates matters is the political economy of operating state-owned enterprises, which is this, that as much as executives have got to be about the business of the state-owned enterprise, they also have to look over their back to ensure that they continue to enjoy the political support that's necessary for them to continue to do their job. And the thing about the political support is that it directly translates to ability to get money from the fiscus in order to continue to do what you do. So Vuyani Jahana, for example, at SAA, needed to quit because, notwithstanding the fact that it come up with a turnaround plan, there was just no political will to find the money. Once they left, money was found, but by that time, you see that there's a battle in order to get SAA right. With Eskom, for me, what is a huge disappointment is the failure to recoup the monies that were lost in projects like Medupi and Kusile, and the failure to build in penalties for these global companies, global energy companies that came and worked with their local counterparts and delivered infrastructure that we couldn't use, such that we are now incurring huge costs, not just at a level of the state-owned enterprise itself, but as an economy as a whole, while we have assets that we have but cannot deliver the energy that was expected from them in order to keep the economy growing. And you find that we tend to think that now you have Praveen, then we pull back as a country and not follow through when it comes to it does do the politicians and the executive and the board get held accountable when they fail to achieve, performance targets within a very short period of time. I mean, we shouldn't be going up to stage 3 levels of load shedding in summertime if these people were doing their job properly.
Well, unfortunately, that seems to be the case right here as we speak. Load shedding haunting South Africa, and this just 24 hours, of course, before the State of the Nation address. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. I'll continue my conversation with Ngama Mtimka after the break. Welcome back to Truth to Power here on ITV Networks. My name is Faraz Patel. I'm continuing my conversation with Ngama Mtimka 24 hours before President Cyril Ramaphosa delivers his State of the Nation address. Ngama, I want to move to land reform. Now, of course, in the winter months that we had, there was a law that was gazetted for a number of thousands of acres of lands to be distributed. It was one of the promises that President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, did make last year in his State of the Nation address, and through Minister of Agriculture and Land Reform, Mstoko Didiza, that was able to go through. But there are still many that want Section 25 of the Constitution to be amended. Is this the year that we see more amendments happening in that part of the Constitution?
The process has been resumed after it was halted for some time. I don't know why it is such a problem for government to, consolidate the plans around amending the section, because all that is being done here, even though some people in the private sector have been anxious about the process, is that an option is being created for the state to expropriate land, property without compensation, and in very specific circumstances, in very specific times. So it should the process should have been committed to wholeheartedly, not as a political ploy to stymie what the EFF were pursuing, or to deal with an internal political machinations within the African National Congress. There's a case to be made for expropriation of land, which is the business case. If you look, for example, municipalities have got problems where sometimes land that is owned by another state-owned enterprise is stifling developments like, let's say, for example, waterfront developments. And processes to access that land are taking long, where you find that the cost of holding the land or keeping the current owner holding the land or property is way higher than the benefits that would come if that land was expropriated and given to another party. So there's a falsehood created that land expropriation without compensation doesn't make economic sense. In fact, we have instances, say, for example, in PE, where you find that if you took land from Transnet and gave it to the city, you could unleash an entire waterfront development that would ensure that there's greater economic value that accrues to the regional economy compared to having that current owner own the land. And obviously, the other one is dilapidated buildings in downtown city centers throughout the major cities in South Africa. You will find that whether it's in Joburg, downtown Joburg, old suburbs like Yeoville, or in Cape Town or Port Elizabeth, you will find that you have an untenable situation where landlords have allowed buildings to be dilapidated and not occupied for a very long periods of time. And those buildings, can be expropriated and be repurposed either for commercial or residential purposes. I know that the DA, for example, during Musimai Mani's time in his 2019 election manifesto, did kind of engage in this. So you find that among South African companies, there's some degree of commitment that this, in fact, is the right thing to do. But for us, the challenge with the state is that sometimes it focuses a lot on improving access to land than it does on improving efficiencies of distribution processes. And also one of the challenges is the politics of having access to buildings. I know there was a process which seemed to be fair last year of availing and identifying state land and asking people to apply to access that land to use it. That is a welcome process, but it will be good to see the results, that the outcomes are not influenced by political connections, or they don't favor too much those that are already powerful in society.
Yeah, Mgema, you bring up a very good point with regards to the capitated buildings. Just the other day I drove past Johannesburg, going through to Fordsburg, around the area just close to Fordsburg, and you could see that in the Newtown area, the name just escaped me, and you could see some of the buildings that have been really run down, and how much of it can be used for the repurposing of the communities, and of course, most importantly, when that does happen, the creation of jobs. Ngama, talking about creation of jobs, and of course, service delivery. Service delivery has been something that has been continually haunting, especially, many of the rural areas and, of course, the townships. And in late Kimi Makwetu's Auditor General report, the wasteful expenditure of municipalities was skyrocketing. I mean, there you could say it's an absolute disaster with regards to the money that has not been spent on the development of municipalities and communities. How important is it now for this current government to change that perception and have your simple, basic service deliveries being given to communities who are in dire need of it?
In order for greater value to communities to be delivered or derived from government service delivery initiatives, we need to ensure that, one, the state buys goods and services from the public or the private sector cost effectively, and those are delivered to communities efficiently. Now, the problem is that because of the parasitic, corrupt practices that are practiced when it comes to the government provided goods and services, you see a lot of extracting of rents, or people taking a lot of money from the state without delivering equivalent value. So whether that's PPE, or in municipalities in the Eastern Cape, for example, where that were drought-stricken, where you see huge amounts of money being charged for delivering water to rural areas, or where you find that municipal infrastructure is deliberately compromised or vandalized so that tenderpreneurs in a particular area could get the tenders to supply the measures that, so for example, if water pipes get to be damaged, then entrepreneurs get contracted to deliver water in remote areas using trucks. That's some of the problems. And then what we've seen is, you mentioned the late Auditor General's reports, that there's a lot of wasteful expenditure which ends up negatively affecting how government provides services to communities. Now, we've known this for a very long time. The challenge is not to see that the leadership is following through when it comes to ensuring that consequences are borne there are consequences for violating municipal laws when it comes to procurement, theft of municipal resources, as well as consequences for fruitless and wasteful expenditure. If South Africa was efficient in ensuring that there were consequences for actions taken that are contrary to the spirit of good value for money and people first, there's a lot of resources that we would have which would help us, increase our impact as a country when it comes to making sure that citizens derive a lot of value from municipal finances and government service delivery.
Ngama, unemployment. This is a scourge that continues to haunt us as a nation. And it's not just unemployment amongst many South Africans, it's unemployment amongst the youth. The figures are scary. And with an economy which continues to be hit by COVID-19, it just further exacerbates the problem that we are having right now. What is the plan with regards to government to solve this out? Because if this does continue, more and more young people are going to be standing, waiting for jobs which may not come.
I think we have a fundamental problem here. It's an industrial policy problem, but also is a broad economic strategy problem. One that tends to concentrate a lot more on what Thabo Mbeki called the first economy or the mainstream economy, where you find that government government targets attracting foreign direct investment or domestic investment and pays little regard to bottom-up entrepreneurial ventures. So as a result of that, we are precluded as a country from homegrown enterprises whose multiplier effect in the economy is greater. In research we did for one of the special economic zones, one of the findings was that it is locally grown enterprises tend to grow with an entire ecosystem that supports them, an entire value chain, which then means that when locally grown enterprises grow into the mainstream economy, they sometimes deliver much better economic consequences compared to their FDI counterparts, which come in the form of capital that can easily flow out of the JSE, or sometimes factories that come from abroad, which get started but come with their global supply chains. So we do need a change of focus to focus on building small businesses and encouraging the growth of that small business, so that as small businesses that are grown from locally grow, they grow with an entire ecosystem that helps boost gross geographic products in certain regions, which ultimately contributes to the gross domestic product. The other thing that we do is to tend to focus on mega infrastructure projects, which, by the way, are good when it comes to showing increases in GDP. But when it comes to achieving shared growth, they leave much to be desired, because those, even though they bring huge financial records in national accounts, they don't tend to be mass-based in terms of who benefits from them.
Well, it's a simple case of the little man not benefiting from whatever project government has there. Well, after the break, the conversation with regards to the build-up for the State of the Nation address, which is happening tomorrow, continues. Stay tuned. We are continuing our conversation to the build-up of the State of the Nation address happening tomorrow, which is said to be delivered by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Ngama, I want to talk about gender-based violence, and of course this has been a scourge that has been with us for such a long time, but of course it took a whole new turn in 2019 when the murder of so many of our women took place. And then of course last year it continued even during a time of the pandemic. What is the work now for government to make sure that shelters, but not just shelters, the overall protection of women through various projects now has to be delivered? The lip service has to end. There needs to be delivery for that protection to happen for the women of our country.
Faraz, I missed the earlier part of your question.
Now, the question was with regards to gender-based violence. Of course, the scourge has continued in our country. 2019, it took a whole new turn, continued last year. What is government's plan now with regards to making sure that the lip service has to be taken out, delivery of protecting our women has to come into effect?
I think there were important legislative developments last year, and also from the machinery that supports or that fights gender-based violence received a boost with the return within the SAPS of units that focus on, responding to gender-based violence. So that those are welcome developments, and obviously the legislative developments too. It's important that a multi-stakeholder approach is used here. I think there are a number of organizations that work in communities that help the government in ensuring that, one, the environment is safe for women. These are organizations that provide home-based care. Some of them also provide immediate response where there has been victimization. So government needs to work a lot more and a lot better with these organizations. One, funding that is offered to these organizations has got to be increased by the Department of Social Development, because we have seen that it is impossible at the level of the state to completely deal with everything that pertains to creating safe spaces for women. Secondly, initiatives that are aimed at empowering women to know what steps to take against an unpermissible cultural environment are also important, because you will find that, for example, in communities that there's a tendency to want to deal with gender-based violence from a family perspective, where the perpetrators may be protected, because we know that there tends to be greater gender-based violence among family members or people that know one another. And the approach to managing a GBV that involves a lot of families ends up sometimes allowing perpetrators to be let off the hook. So there does need to be interventions from a legislative perspective which help regulate that or eliminate elements which tend to stifle the reporting of cases and the follow-throughs, but also there's a need to continue to study the social responses to GBV in ways that help affirm what is working at the level of community and correct what is not working. Because it's impossible for government to do all of that is necessary on its own.
Ungama, we have to touch on corruption. And ever since, the presidency of Jacob Zuma with regards to SOEs, it has absolutely taken a whole new turn. Of course, the Gupta family coming in, exerting their influence over government. And then one would have thought that with President Cyril Ramaphosa coming in, it would have stopped. Unfortunately, it hasn't. And with regards to the PPE tender, fraud and corruption cases that continue to happen, it just continues to take a whole new level. Now, the SIU and, of course, the NPA have been trying to flex their muscles with regards to arrests. But, Ungama, what do we need to do to make sure, as the public playing our role in keeping the awareness, but, of course, the responsibility resting on government shoulders to make sure that prosecutions will turn into arrests?
Sure. So there are a number of things when it comes to corruption. First of all, we've got the responsive law enforcement things that need to be done, starting from the reporting of cases, the immediate action on those cases, the investigations, the prosecution, and ensuring that somebody gets convicted. And then also there is the need to invest on preventative measures when it comes to corruption, all the way from national to local government level. I'm happy, as you point out correctly, that we have at least attempted as a country to boost the capacity to respond to cases of corruption in ways that ensure that some actions get taken, and that will go a long way in ensuring that there's a deterrence for corruption. So I'm happy, for example, with the SIU report in October that showed that over 5,000 employees within Eskom had been investigated, and some monies were recouped as a result of the work of the SIU. I think about 100 million, I can't remember now whether that was in Eskom itself or in other institutions as well. The work of the Zondo Commission has helped to ensure that about 130 million is back into state coffers, as well as making sure that the NPA is following through on cases and ensuring that the prosecution happens and it is successful. So I'm happy and I'm energized about how the sleeping giant has been awoken slightly there. We've seen also recently that the powerful in society have been followed, such as Ace Magashule and others in the asbestos project. And I think that what we need is the NPA to do a lot more of these cases that affect powerful politicians. Because unless there are consequences for senior politicians in the political system, those that see themselves as small fish will continue to loot as well. But I do believe, for us, that we've got a bigger problem of a civil service whose culture is prone to corruption. This has been the case throughout the history of the state in South Africa. I think Nifan Firen makes the point in Apartheid, Guns and Money that we don't have a challenge of an otherwise good state becoming bad in post-apartheid South Africa. We have a problem of a chronically corrupt civil service becoming a lot more corrupt. So there needs to be a lot that is done in terms of the recruitment processes. I mean, you've seen companies, for example, factoring in integrity and integrity scores as part of their recruitment. I think it's time that we do those kinds of things too at the level of the state. And also, we need to have measures that are aimed at improving values, improving morals, and that is work that can be done through faith-based organizations too. It's not something that arises out of business schools and higher institutions of higher learning, even though they do train around ethics and morality. But this is something that requires, again, a multi-stakeholder approach to ensure that you prevent the tendency to want to steal and the responsiveness of the law enforcement apparatus in instances where those preventative measures fail.
You mentioned the sleeping or waking of the sleeping giant, Umgama, and for that giant to go ahead and fully flex its muscles. Of course, the budget speech is quite a few weeks away from Minister Tito Mboweni delivering it. But do you believe that more money needs to be pumped into the SIU or the NPA or the Hawks in order for them to flex their muscles and make these prosecutions into arrests?
That's very much important for us. And I think the case, the allegations that have been made about SARPA, for example, the regulator of medicines and medical products, that private funding may have a negative consequence in what gets to be approved. I mean, this has not been proved. It's an allegation that is made. Makes us to be alert to how harmful would it be if these organizations have to rely on funding that comes from outside of the country or outside of state coffers if the state doesn't avail funding to them. Indeed, they must think creatively about how they fund their programs. But national security can be compromised if these agencies are not funded so that they fulfill their mandates correctly and in full. And also, we don't want to expose them to donor finance in ways that may end up compromising national interests too.
I'm in conversation with Nkama Mtimka. We are doing a build-up to the State of the Nation address, which is set to happen tomorrow evening. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Truth to Power. We are building up to tomorrow evening's State of the Nation address to be delivered by President Cyril Ramaphosa. And now I would like to bring in Kaya Sitole, political analyst, into the conversation. Kaya, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you and good evening to everyone.
Well, Kaya, of course, we need to touch on the fourth year of President Cyril Ramaphosa's delivery of the State of the Nation address. All eyes are on him. The country is in a state of peril. How important will this State of the Nation address be because of the COVID situation that we are in, because corruption continues to rise, and because there are so many problems that are plaguing South Africa right now?
So the risk that always exists with us talking about State of the Nation addresses is that we always gravitate towards saying this one is the most important of them all, simply because of the benefit of recent memory. But I think what we really are facing here is probably the most critical for him as the leader of the country and the leader of the ANC, because unfortunately, we know that this year we've got a local government election, and some of the things that he says tomorrow are going to be used as a prism from which we evaluate the ANC's capacity to govern, particularly during a crisis. And when I say a crisis, it's not that we haven't been living in a crisis when you look at our high unemployment and our poverty rates, but I think this is a unique crisis in that it's a healthcare crisis where we're hoping that in at least in one instance, the government can exhibit traits of proper competence, and that they've struggled on that means that the electorate is going to be quite critical in evaluating the party ahead of the local government elections. So I do think that particularly because he didn't have the opportunity to have the pageantry associated with the January 8th statement, where they can at least then go out into the grassroots movement and show up support for the ANC, and the fact that they still probably won't be able to do that ahead of the local government elections anyway, he's going to try to be as statemently as possible and enable members of his party to then be able to take snippets from what he says tomorrow to be able to say, oh, by the way, only these things are only happening because the ANC is in power. And if you sort of vote in any other way, then some of these social protection measures, for example, would not be there. So it's going to be a very interesting, delicate act when he delivers a speech tomorrow.
To you, Nkama, and just like what Kaya was saying right over there with regards to this being a year of local government elections, the importance of President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address tomorrow.
It's an important one. Not only is it an election year, but there's a number of political factors, that affect the State of the Nation address, political, economic. The biggest issue, for example, is around the extent to which government is managing the recovery and stimulating and undertaking initiatives that help stimulate a return to normalcy economically. We know that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, South Africa wasn't doing well economically. So the president is being looked at and in fact is beginning to be criticized for a number of failures around, for example, the failure of the economic stimulus package, whether it's the inaccessibility of the 500 billion that was created for business support, or the declining investments of the state when it comes to infrastructure. So there's quite a number of challenges that make South Africans look at the president. And in fact, it's against a very critical eye that says some of the things that were done may not have been justified given the extent of peril that we now face. And he's also politically challenged in the sense that many people within his own party are looking at him on the basis on which he's going to be able to rise above the political, economic issues he's facing, so that, they obviously, his political opponents want him to fail, so that they can, lead the charge to have him removed. And he does need to show some degree of success from his side in order to save himself.
Kaya, promises. I mean, every single State of the Nation address has its promises, and taxpayers like yourself, like you two, including myself, when we look at it and some of those promises are not being delivered, of course, we always make that statement, here we go again. Having your political wisdom, and I'm going to start with you, Kaya, are we going to be disappointed again come the next State of the Nation address?
Look, I think from the moment we allowed this current president to tell us that he was going to invest in some new high-speed city and some high-speed trains, when we knew that he couldn't even get, textbook delivered to schools, for example, on time, we've been accepting a lot of really ambitious and pointless and really meaningless epithets from State of the Nation addresses. And I think what we've now learned is that in spite of the fact that the government knows that its capacity to deliver and execute on its promises quite simply doesn't exist, that doesn't stop them from being ambitious in crafting the speech. So I expect a bit more of the same tomorrow, but I think what we now know is that the electorate is becoming much more robust in interrogating exactly when these things are going to be delivered and how they're going to be delivered. And remember, a key element of getting this Ramaphosa administration to be insulated from accountability is the fact that it simply does not engage with the media. So the opportunities for people to be able to interrogate him and ask follow-up questions on the things that he promises has been severely limited. And of course, the one instrument that is supposed to do that very well is the parliamentary process. And in the parliamentary process, for as long as the ANC has been in power, it's been of the view that it's not really the duty of its MPs to interrogate its executives. And what you then have to gravitate to is to hope that the opposition parties craft together strong enough conversations in order to hold the president accountable. But a lot of people do not see that as the primary instrument of accountability, right? Because guess what? As much as the parliamentary processes do exist, we still don't see service delivery, do we?
Ngama, we spoke about this earlier on, of course, the service delivery and the lack thereof with regards to it. Are we going to be disappointed come the end of tomorrow evening's State of the Nation address?
So, as I was saying, part of the challenge with the State of the Nation addresses is that they don't have a defined framework of reporting about what's happening in the state of the nation, and also what targets are set for a given year. So what you will find is the tendency of politicians to pick and choose whatever they think they can write home about. And they know that in the following year, they don't have to use that State of the Nation address as a framework for reporting. So indeed, we will always be disappointed, because there will always be this sense that the president doesn't address in a reporting format all those things which they promised in the previous period, and use that same framework in order to set new targets. So it's a challenge, and I think that, as I said before, part of the problem is the fact that the political culture of the governing party is not geared to assess performance. All that matters for the governing party is what alliances get built in a particular time, and those alliances have got no regard whatsoever to performance.
Gentlemen, one final question. Kaya, I'm going to start with you. We saw the Nkandla Tea Party happening last week, Friday. We, of course, have the ATM continuing to make the noise of the motion of no confidence. And, of course, the other faction of the ANC continues to grow their teeth and there continues to be noises that happens. Now, I know it's a far-fetched question because we've always had this ideal that the president of South Africa has to serve at least one term. We've seen, of course, 2 terms being served by President Cyril Ramaphosa's predecessors. Are we at the view right now to think that come next year, President Cyril Ramaphosa may not be the president in charge delivering the State of the Nation address?
No, I don't think we're at that stage yet. And I've always said cynically to some people that his competitors, or at least the people that would seek to unseat him, quite simply do not have the type of resources that are necessary to do that, because at its very heart, at its grassroots, the ANC is still a very cash-intensive political machine. If you want people to be able to go and, attend branch meetings, for example, in order for them to get their preferred candidates, it's a very high logistics machine that you have to run. And I quite simply do not see any of his prospective opponents or prospective adversaries having enough resources in order to be able to do that. And also the ANC doesn't have perhaps the type of event lined up this year that would then enable a lot of its members to congregate together and formulate a plan. I think the National General Council that they may or may not have is probably not going to have sufficient time for people to mobilize and unseat him. So I still expect him to be there by this time next year. The question of what happens 24 months from now is very different, because next December, there is indeed the elective conference of 2022.
Umgama Eskaya says the next ANC elective conference at the end of 2022. Are you of the same view of Kaya that come next year, President Cyril Ramaphosa will be delivering the 2022 State of the Nation address?
I largely agree on the basis of all the things that Kaya highlighted. What my problem is with President Cyril Ramaphosa for us is his sense of failure to interpret the moment and what it dictates to his presidency in the ANC. So since Nasrec, you've had a split organization that has remained together with the pretense that it may become a more solid party. And my view is that there's no question about whether or not the ANC as we know it is going to remain. The question is, how do those who are in charge of the party currently from both factions precipitate what is a necessary split in order to ensure that whoever is left with brand ANC is able to rebuild post the conference next year? He seems to be sleepishly believing that he can control things, and so it's okay for him to be on the same crawl with the lion, if we can assume that he's a sheep. And I think he's going to get a shock of his life if one or two of the political counter tactics that his counterparts are working on can gain some steam. So while accepting what Kaya is saying in terms of the improbability of some of these machinations that are being planned to gain steam, I'm saying if any of them were to in fact gain some steam, the consequences would be very dire for the president, and he would regret his approach that continues to believe on the false idea that some unity deal may be brokered among the warring factions.
Well, that's all we have time for, gentlemen. Umgama Mtinka and Akaya Sitole, we thank you so much for sharing your political wisdom 24 hours ahead of the State of the Nation address.
Thank you.
No, it was an absolute pleasure. Well, there we have it. Of course, the State of the Nation address set to happen tomorrow evening. And we are a country, as we speak, a healthcare system that continues to deteriorate. We have the vaccine rollout, which many people are questioning what is going to happen if it does go through a tenderpreneur process. And of course, corruption, another scourge that is there. Gender-based violence continues to have its scourge within the country. The problems continue to mount. So, Mr. President, our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, all we are asking you is find a way to solve the situation, to make South Africa an economically viable country, a safe country for our women and children, and of course a country that we as South Africans can continue to be proud of. Well, this has been another edition of Truth to Power with myself, Faraz Patel. I will see you again, same time, same place next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.